What would you do if you discovered your spouse's betrayal? Watch the full story and find out how this twisted affair turns deadly. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Can you guess who's responsible for Lisa's death? Watch the full reveal and comment your theories. Betrayal, who did it? Don't miss the shocking truth behind the affair. Subscribe to stay updated on this suspenseful journey. David Matthews never expected to find his life shattered in such a way. A mechanic by trade, he was a simple man, devoted to his wife Lisa and the life they had built together. He loved her deeply and had always thought their marriage was strong. But when he stumbled upon the truth, everything changed. It started with a simple late-night argument. David had noticed that Lisa had become distant over the past few months. She was always on her phone, never looking him in the eyes, and her once warm demeanor had turned cold. He tried to ignore it, but deep down, something didn't feel right. That night, after Lisa had gone to bed, David's curiosity got the best of him. He began snooping through her things, her phone, her purse, even the trash. It was there, amidst discarded receipts and old letters, that he found the first clue. It was a message on her phone. One that seemed innocent at first, but had a chilling subtext. "I miss you so much," the message read. "I can't wait to see you again tonight." David's heart raced as he realized the message wasn't from him. His wife was having an affair. His hands shook as he read more of the texts. The names began to blur together. "I love you. It's not just physical. You mean everything to me." The words were too intimate to ignore, and then there it was, the name that shattered his world. Pastor Harris. Pastor Harris. The man David had looked up to for years. The man who had married him and Lisa. The man who had always been a pillar of the community. The man who, David now realized, had stolen his wife's heart. The truth was clear. His wife, the woman he had given everything for, had been cheating on him with their pastor. David's anger was palpable. How could she do this to him? How could Pastor Harris betray him like this? He immediately began to plan his next steps, consumed by rage and the need for answers. The next day, David confronted Lisa. She had no idea what was coming. "Tell me it's not true," David said, his voice low and trembling. "Tell me you haven't been seeing Pastor Harris behind my back." Lisa's face drained of color as she tried to avoid his gaze. "David, I didn't mean for it to happen. It was just..." "Don't lie to me, Lisa," David shouted, his chest heaving with emotion. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been sleeping with him?" Tears welled up in Lisa's eyes. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not what you think. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." David could hardly contain his fury. His world was falling apart, and he had no idea how to pick up the pieces. "I can't believe this," he muttered, backing away. "I thought I knew you, but I was wrong." As Lisa tried to explain, David's mind was already racing with thoughts of what to do next. His anger, his feelings of betrayal, and the pain of realizing that his marriage had been a lie consumed him. But he also knew one thing for sure. Pastor Harris would pay for what he had done. Pastor Harris had always been known as a pillar of the community. His sermons were filled with passion, hope, and conviction. He was the kind of man everyone turned to in times of trouble. His life seemed to be one of constant service to the Lord, of guidance and wisdom that others leaned on. Yet beneath this facade of godliness, there was a man conflicted, a man carrying burdens that no one knew about, burdens that had nothing to do with Scripture or faith. In his own house, Pastor Harris was far from the figure of strength that the church saw him to be. His marriage to Jennifer had been on shaky ground for years. They had been married for over 15 years, but the spark that once ignited their relationship had long since faded. Jennifer, a kind and loving woman, had once adored her husband. She had supported him through every trial, every challenge. But over time, something shifted. The closeness they had shared slowly withered as Pastor Harris became more and more absorbed in his work at the church. Jennifer had noticed the change in him. He was no longer the man she had married. His eyes were distant. His touch was cold. and the warmth that used to fill their home had been replaced with silence. The love they had shared now felt like a distant memory. Instead of talking about their issues, they simply existed together under the same roof, each trapped in their own world. Jennifer felt alone, ignored by the man she had pledged her life to. She tried to fill the gap with charity work, with spending more time with their children, but nothing seemed to work. She was slipping away, and Pastor Harris was oblivious to it. Then came Lisa. Lisa Matthews wasn't a stranger to Pastor Harris. She had been attending the church for years, and over time, she became one of the most devoted members. Her loyalty to the church was unquestionable. She volunteered at every event, helped with the youth group, and even assisted in the church's outreach programs. But there was more to Lisa than met the eye. Beneath her kind-hearted exterior, Lisa was struggling with her own personal demons. She felt neglected and invisible in her marriage with David, and despite David's quiet devotion, she longed for something more. She wanted to feel desired, to feel alive again, and that's where Pastor Harris stepped in. It was during a counseling session that the affair began. Lisa had come to Pastor Harris for advice, seeking solace over her growing discontent in her marriage. She told him how David had become distant, how he no longer paid attention to her the way he used to. She shared how she felt like she was invisible to him. Pastor Harris listened attentively, offering her gentle words of comfort and empathy. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that seemed to reach deep within her. He was a man of God, someone who had always known how to console, but in that moment, his touch lingered a little too long. His words carried a different weight. After that initial meeting, the lines began to blur. Pastor Harris found himself drawn to Lisa in ways he hadn't expected. She was a beautiful woman, full of life, and she made him feel things that had been absent in his own marriage for years. At first, it was small, an accidental touch, a lingering hug, an encouraging word that seemed to say more than what was spoken. But soon, it became something more. They began meeting outside of church for lunch, sharing quiet conversations in the back of the church, exchanging looks that went beyond the professional. For Pastor Harris, this affair was a secret he couldn't control. The guilt gnawed at him, but so did the excitement of being desired again. It wasn't just physical. Lisa made him feel seen, valued, things he hadn't felt in years with Jennifer. The disconnection in his marriage had created an emotional void that he didn't know how to fill. And Lisa, with her youthful energy and charm, had unknowingly filled that gap. Lisa, too, found herself drawn to Pastor Harris, the man who had always been there for her, who had listened when no one else had. He was different. He made her feel special. For the first time in a long while, she felt alive, seen, and wanted. The affair started slowly, almost imperceptibly. They spent more time together, their meetings more frequent, their conversations more intimate. Pastor Harris would tell her about his struggles with Jennifer, about how he felt disconnected from his wife, and Lisa, always the listener, offered him the empathy and understanding he craved. One night, after a church event, when the building was quiet and everyone else had gone home, Pastor Harris and Lisa found themselves alone. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Pastor Harris stood in front of her, his gaze intense, and before he could even think, he kissed her. It wasn't passionate at first. It was tender, almost hesitant. But as the kiss deepened, so did their need for one another. The affair had begun. At first, they tried to keep it secret, but as time passed, their meetings became bolder. They found secret places to meet, empty hotel rooms, dark corners of the church. No one suspected the man of God and the devoted member of his congregation could be capable of such betrayal. But in the shadows, their secret love affair flourished. Meanwhile, Jennifer Harris was left in the dark. She had no idea what was going on between her husband and Lisa. She could feel the emotional distance growing, but she attributed it to the stress of his work. She never suspected that the man she had been married to for over a decade could be betraying her in the worst way possible. As the months passed, her suspicions grew, but the truth was a far cry from what she had imagined. Back at the Matthews house, David had become increasingly suspicious. He could feel Lisa's emotional distance, but he couldn't figure out why. He tried to talk to her, but she kept deflecting. Little did he know, the answers he sought were hidden in the most unlikely place. The church, with Pastor Harris, the very man who had counseled him in times of trouble. In the dark recesses of their lives, Pastor Harris and Lisa's affair was slowly unraveling the very fabric of their families. Neither of them knew how deep this would go or the devastating consequences that would soon follow. Their secret was about to become a nightmare for everyone involved. David Matthews had always been a patient man, one who believed in keeping his emotions in check. As a successful businessman and a loving husband, he had prided himself on being the steady one in his marriage. But all of that changed when he discovered the truth about Lisa, his wife of 10 years. The truth that she had been having an affair with none other than Pastor Harris, the man he had respected and trusted more than anyone else in his life. The discovery had torn David apart. His world, once stable and predictable, had been shattered in an instant. His mind swirled with anger, confusion, and pain. He had trusted the pastor to be a guide for his family, to provide spiritual counsel when needed. He had never imagined that the man he had confided in, who had baptized his children and officiated their wedding, would betray him in such a cruel, unforgivable way. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the betrayal of everything he had believed in. For days, David could barely sleep. The images of his wife and Pastor Harris together kept replaying in his mind. He had seen the little things, Lisa's distant behavior, her late nights, her unexplained absences, but it had never occurred to him that something so horrific was happening right under his nose. He had been too trusting, too blind. The anger he felt toward his wife was one thing, but the rage directed at Pastor Harris consumed him. David had always prided himself on being a logical thinker. He was a man who handled problems with calculated precision, but the discovery of this betrayal had thrown him into a whirlwind of emotions. Every time he thought about confronting Lisa, the images of her with Pastor Harris flooded his mind. How could she do this to him? How could she betray the trust they had built over the years? But as much as he wanted to yell at her, to make her feel the hurt he was feeling, something inside him told him he needed to go straight to the source of the pain, Pastor Harris. He had to confront the man who had so effortlessly wormed his way into his marriage, who had taken everything from him. David knew that his confrontation with Pastor Harris would be volatile. There was no way it couldn't be. The hurt, the anger, the betrayal, it was all too much to hold inside. But what made the anger even sharper was that David knew Pastor Harris would never admit to the affair willingly. No, David would have to expose the truth. He would have to make the pastor face what he had done. The plan formed slowly in David's mind. He couldn't do this quietly. It would be an explosive confrontation. He would walk into Pastor Harris's house, look him in the eye, and demand the truth. He would make the pastor understand the pain he had caused. And if Pastor Harris refused to admit his guilt, David would find a way to expose him. He wasn't going to let him get away with this. But even as David's anger burned, a small part of him was terrified of what would happen once he finally confronted the pastor. What if it went too far? What if his anger, his rage, led him to do something he couldn't take back? What if he ended up losing everything in one moment of fury? In the days leading up to the confrontation, David became consumed by the thought of exposing Pastor Harris. He spent hours pacing through his house, imagining the confrontation in every possible way. He was mentally preparing himself for the moment he would finally face the man who had destroyed his marriage. But the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He wanted the world to know what Pastor Harris had done, to see the hypocrisy of the man who had preached about love and faith but had betrayed his own congregation. Meanwhile, Lisa was struggling with her own demons. The guilt she felt was overwhelming. She had never intended for things to get so out of control. It had started innocently enough, Just a little conversation here and there, a bit of attention from someone who made her feel seen. But as the affair had progressed, it had consumed her. Now, standing on the precipice of losing everything, Lisa couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. She loved Pastor Harris. There was no doubt about that. But the weight of the consequences was starting to crush her. David, the man who had always been there for her, the man who had been her rock, was shattered. And what had she done? She had betrayed him in the worst possible way. She had torn their family apart. And now she had to live with the knowledge that she had played a major role in the destruction of everything they had built together. It wasn't just the guilt over David that tormented Lisa. It was also the deep shame she felt over her affair with Pastor Harris. He was a man of faith, a man she had once respected and looked up to. How could she have fallen for someone like him? How could she have allowed herself to be swept away by his charm and attention, knowing all along that she was betraying her vows to her husband? The reality of the situation hit her like a wave. She had hurt two people deeply. She had ruined her marriage, and she had destroyed her own reputation in the eyes of the community. The thought of what would happen if David found out, if everyone found out, was enough to make her stomach turn. But even with the guilt eating away at her, Lisa found herself caught between two men. On one hand, there was David, the man she had loved, the man who had always been there for her. On the other, there was Pastor Harris, the man who had made her feel wanted and appreciated, the man who had shown her a side of herself she hadn't known existed. Lisa was torn between the man she had promised to love forever and the man who had given her something she didn't even realize she was missing. But the reality was that she couldn't have both. One would have to be sacrificed. And as David's anger grew, the decision was becoming all too clear. As the day of the confrontation drew near, Lisa became increasingly anxious. She didn't know what David would do when he finally found out. Would he confront her? Would he confront Pastor Harris? Would he forgive her, or would he leave her for good? The answers to these questions hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. David's anger was a force of nature now, and Lisa couldn't escape it. She couldn't outrun the consequences of her actions. The time had come for the truth to be revealed, and David Matthews was ready to face Pastor Harris. He was going to get answers, no matter the cost. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet church parking lot. The air was thick with tension as David Matthews sat in his car, staring at the front doors of the church. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart was pounding in his chest, a mix of rage and anticipation swelling inside him. The moment had come. He could no longer sit by in silence, allowing Pastor Harris to continue his betrayal. He had to confront him, to force the pastor to admit the truth and feel the weight of what he had done. David had spent sleepless nights, wrestling with his emotions. He had walked through the scenarios in his mind over and over again, imagining what he would say, how he would react. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning. He had to make Pastor Harris understand the pain he had caused, the destruction he had left in his wake. As David got out of the car, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. His footsteps echoed in the quiet parking lot as he made his way to the church doors. He didn't know what kind of reception he would receive, but he didn't care. He was beyond caring. The anger had consumed him entirely. The church doors creaked as David pushed them open, stepping into the cool interior. The faint scent of incense lingered in the air, but there was no time to appreciate the sacredness of the space. His focus was singular. Pastor Harris. He had to find him. David didn't have to search long. Pastor Harris was at the front of the church preparing for the evening service. When he saw David walk in, a flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a smile, a mask of calm professionalism. "David, what are you doing here?" Pastor Harris asked, his voice calm but tinged with an edge of concern. "I'm here to talk to you," David said, his voice low but filled with anger. "About what you've done to my family." Pastor Harris's expression faltered for a brief moment before he regained his composure. He knew exactly what David was talking about, but he wasn't about to let this confrontation escalate. "David, I don't know what you're talking about. Let's sit down and—" "No," David cut him off, his voice rising with fury. "You don't get to play the innocent one anymore. You've been sleeping with my wife. You've been destroying my family for months, and I want to know why." Pastor Harris's face grew pale, but he quickly recovered. He stepped toward David, trying to remain calm. "David, this is not the place for this. We can talk about this privately, but right now you're making things worse. Please, let's go somewhere we can speak without making a scene." But David wasn't having it. He had been patient for too long, and the anger that had been simmering inside him now boiled over. He lunged forward, grabbing Pastor Harris by the collar, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you can just destroy my life and walk away from it? You're nothing but a coward," David shouted, his voice echoing through the church. Pastor Harris's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face as he tried to push David away. But David was too strong, his grip unrelenting. The two men struggled for a moment, their emotions raw, their bodies colliding in a mix of rage and desperation. In a fit of rage, David threw a punch. The blow landed hard against Pastor Harris's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. The pastor's head slammed against one of the pews, and he collapsed to the floor, dazed and stunned. Blood trickled from his lip, and he groaned in pain as he tried to push himself up. David stood over him, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with each breath. His heart raced with adrenaline, but there was no satisfaction in it. No relief. Only more anger. "You're going to pay for this," David said, his voice seething with venom. "You've destroyed my family, and now you'll face the consequences." Pastor Harris, shaken and furious, managed to pull himself to his feet. His eyes were filled with a mixture of pain and rage as he glared at David. "You think you can intimidate me? You think this is over? You don't know who you're dealing with." The pastor's words, though defiant, did little to calm David. He had pushed past the point of reason. His emotions had taken control, and he wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He was just consumed by the need for retribution, for making Pastor Harris feel the way he had felt for weeks. Betrayed, powerless, humiliated. David turned and stormed out of the church, his mind racing. He didn't even care if anyone saw him. He had made his point. But even as he walked away, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. Had he gone too far? Had he done something that couldn't be undone? Meanwhile, Pastor Harris sat on the floor, blood dripping from his lip, his heart pounding with a mixture of pain and fury. His head throbbed as he tried to clear his mind. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His pride, his carefully constructed facade, had been shattered in an instant. The man he had once considered a friend had just turned on him, and now he was left to pick up the pieces. But Pastor Harris wasn't going to let this go. He had to deal with this. And he had to do it on his terms. He was a man of power, of influence. He would not let David Matthews destroy him. As Pastor Harris left the church, his mind was consumed with thoughts of how to fix the situation. He had to make sure that no one found out about the affair, about the weakness he had shown. He had to protect his reputation, his ministry, and most importantly, his family. That night, as Pastor Harris lay in bed, his mind raced. He had to confront Lisa about the affair. He had to make sure she understood the gravity of the situation. But as he drifted off to sleep, a cold dread filled his chest. He had no idea that this night would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Back at Lisa's home, she was nervously waiting for her husband, unsure of what would happen next. She hadn't heard from him since the confrontation, and she was consumed by a feeling of dread. She knew David's temper well, and she feared that the confrontation might have gone too far. But she didn't know how far it had truly gone, until she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The sun had barely risen over the small town of Greenfield when the news spread like wildfire. Lisa Matthews was dead. It wasn't long before the phone lines began buzzing and neighbors whispered among themselves. How could this have happened? Just yesterday, she had been fine, going about her daily routine, living what seemed like an ordinary life. And now, in the cold light of morning, Lisa Matthews was found lifeless in her home. A mystery no one could immediately explain. The police were quick to respond, but there were no obvious signs of foul play at first glance. Lisa's body was found on the living room floor, an expression of shock frozen on her face, as though she had been caught by surprise in the final moments of her life. Her clothes were disheveled, but there were no visible wounds or signs of struggle. The house itself was eerily quiet, with no indication of a break-in or anything out of the ordinary. At first, the officers on the scene considered the possibility of an accident. Maybe she had fainted or a heart attack had taken her in the night, but something about the scene felt wrong. The feeling of unease grew as Detective Claire Armstrong, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp intuition and no-nonsense approach, arrived at the scene. Detective Armstrong had been with the Greenfield Police Department for over a decade. She was methodical, with a reputation for solving cases that had others stumped. Her piercing green eyes scanned the room as she stepped into Lisa's modest home. She took note of the overturned coffee mug on the coffee table, the way the curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze, and the disarray of Lisa's belongings scattered on the floor. She was used to seeing crime scenes, but this one didn't sit right with her. "Anything unusual?" she asked one of the officers standing nearby. "Not much, Detective. No sign of forced entry, no clear cause of death. It seems like an accident, but we're still waiting on the coroner's report." Claire nodded, her sharp gaze still sweeping the room. Something didn't add up. Lisa Matthews had been married, but her husband, David, hadn't been home when the officers arrived. According to neighbors, he had gone to work early that morning. But Claire had a gut feeling that the circumstances surrounding Lisa's death were anything but ordinary. She turned to one of the officers. "Call the coroner. Let's get an autopsy done as soon as possible. And I want a full report on Lisa's background, her relationships, her social circle. We may need to talk to her husband and anyone who was close to her." As the officers began to gather more information, Claire stepped outside to talk to some of the neighbors. They were shocked by the news, but no one seemed to have much to offer in terms of new information. Lisa had been a quiet woman, friendly but private. She kept to herself, only occasionally speaking with the neighbors or attending church events. But then, Claire spoke with a woman named Karen, who lived next door. Karen had known Lisa for years and seemed to be more familiar with the details of her life than anyone else. "Lisa wasn't the same these past few months," Karen said, her voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might give away a secret. "She seemed distant, and I noticed her arguing with David a lot. It wasn't like them, not at all. They used to be so close." Detective Armstrong's ears perked up. "Arguing? Do you know what about?" Karen hesitated, glancing nervously at the house. "I don't know all the details, but I overheard a few things. Lisa had been, she'd been seeing someone else. Someone from the church, I think. Pastor Harris." Claire felt a jolt of surprise, but she kept her composure. Pastor Harris, the well-respected man of the cloth, the leader of the local church? She had to admit it didn't fit. But then again, people weren't always what they appeared to be. She nodded slowly, thanking Karen for her time, and made her way back to her car. The information Karen had given her was crucial. A secret affair? It was a lead, no doubt. Claire knew that secrets were often the key to unraveling the truth behind a death. And if there was one thing she had learned in her years as an investigator, it was that no one was immune to temptation, not even those who preached from the pulpit. Back at the station, Claire sat at her desk, her mind running through the possibilities. She had worked enough cases to know that a death like this, one with no obvious cause, no clear evidence of foul play, often meant that someone was hiding something. Someone had something to lose. Her first step was clear. She needed to talk to David Matthews, Lisa's husband. If there was any truth to Karen's story about an affair, David might know something that could help explain what had happened. But more importantly, Claire needed to understand how deep the web of secrets ran. Who else was involved in Lisa's life? What was the connection to Pastor Harris? As Claire prepared to head to the Matthews house to speak with David, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The beginning of a much darker story than anyone in Greenfield was prepared for. Detective Claire Armstrong's mind was consumed with questions as she prepared for her next round of interviews. Lisa Matthews' sudden and mysterious death had quickly unraveled into something much darker than anyone could have imagined. The truth was hidden behind layers of deception, and it was Claire's job to pull them apart, one by one. Her first stop that morning was to the Matthews household to speak with David. She had already gathered enough background information to know that his life was far from perfect. His marriage to Lisa had been strained in recent months, and now, with the possibility of an affair hanging over the investigation, Claire was determined to understand the full scope of their relationship. David was at home when Claire arrived. He greeted her at the door with a thin, forced smile, his face pale and tired. His eyes, once full of anger, now held a deep emptiness, as if he were numb to the world around him. "Detective Armstrong, please come in," David said quietly, stepping aside to let her enter. I still don't understand what happened. Why would Lisa be taken from me like this?" Claire took a seat at the kitchen table, her eyes scanning the room. It was a modest home, but there was something unsettling about the way everything was arranged, perfectly neat, yet devoid of warmth. She had seen this type of detachment before, when people were trying to hide something. "I'm sorry for your loss, David," she said gently, her voice calm but firm. "But I need to ask you some questions. I need to understand everything that happened in the days leading up to Lisa's death." David nodded, his lips trembling slightly. "I already told the officers everything I know. I don't know how this happened. Lisa was fine when I left for work that morning. I spoke to her briefly, but then I got the call. I came straight home." Claire studied him, watching his every move. His answers were rehearsed, his emotions controlled, but Claire had learned long ago to trust her instincts. Something wasn't adding up. "I understand that you and Lisa had been going through a tough time lately." Claire pressed. "Do you know if she had been seeing anyone else? Perhaps someone at church?" David's face tightened. He stood up and began pacing the room. I don't want to talk about that. It's none of your business." Claire didn't back down. "David, if you want answers, we need to be honest with each other. People are hiding things. If you know something about your wife's affair, now is the time to tell me." At the mention of the affair, David froze. His eyes grew wide, a mixture of fear and anger flickering in his gaze. For a long moment, he didn't speak, as if processing what Claire had just said. "You know about Pastor Harris?" David finally asked, his voice low. "I suspected something was off, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that she—" He paused, unable to finish the sentence. Claire remained quiet, allowing him to collect his thoughts. She could see the pain in his eyes, but there was something more there, something darker, a hidden edge that suggested David was holding back. "I'm not here to pass judgment," Claire said softly. "I just need the truth. Did you confront Lisa about this?" David looked away, his jaw clenched. "No, I didn't have to. I knew. It was obvious. But I didn't want to make things worse. We already had enough problems." Claire nodded, keeping her focus on David. "Do you think Lisa's affair had something to do with her death?" David seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking nervously to the floor. I don't know, but I'm telling you, Detective, I didn't hurt her. I would never." Claire raised her hand, cutting him off. "I'm not accusing you of anything yet, David, but I need to speak to everyone who might have been involved, including Pastor Harris." David's face turned pale at the mention of Pastor Harris's name. He visibly recoiled, a look of disgust crossing his features. "Pastor Harris. He's the reason everything fell apart. He came into our lives pretending to be a friend, a mentor, but I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to face it." With that, Claire knew it was time to visit Pastor Harris. Later that day, Claire drove to the church where Pastor Harris worked. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but she knew one thing. The pastor was hiding something. She found him in his office, sitting behind a large oak desk, looking every bit the part of a well-respected man of faith. But his eyes, when they met hers, held none of the warmth that one might expect from someone who had devoted their life to helping others. Instead, they were hard, guarded, and defensive. "Detective Armstrong, I assume you're here to talk about Lisa," Pastor Harris said, his voice smooth but tinged with an undercurrent of tension. Claire nodded, taking a seat across from him. "Yes, I need to ask you a few questions. I'm investigating her death, and I need to understand everything that happened leading up to it." Pastor Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands folding in front of him. I don't know what to tell you. I'm devastated by Lisa's passing. We had a friendship, but I never would have imagined something like this would happen." Claire's gaze sharpened. "You had more than just a friendship with Lisa, didn't you?" He looked at her, his eyes flashing with something like fear. "That's not your concern. I was just trying to help her. She was going through a lot." Claire leaned forward, her tone firm. "I know about the affair, Pastor Harris, and I'm trying to figure out what led to Lisa's death. You're involved, and I need you to be honest with me." Pastor Harris's face paled, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a deep sigh, he spoke, his voice quiet but intense. "I didn't kill her, Detective. I may have made mistakes, but I didn't hurt Lisa. I didn't have anything to do with her death." But Claire wasn't convinced. The more she spoke with him, the more she could sense his fear. The pieces were starting to come together, but she still didn't have the full picture. The web of lies surrounding Lisa's death was tightening, and every person involved had something to break. As the day came to a close, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to the truth. The lies were beginning to unravel, and the tension between David, Pastor Harris, and Lisa was undeniable. But the question remained: who was responsible for Lisa's death? And what role had each of them played in the tragic events that led to that fateful night? The investigation was far from over, but Claire knew one thing for sure. There was more to this case than anyone had imagined, and she was determined to uncover it all. Detective Claire Armstrong sat at her desk late into the night, sifting through the mountain of evidence she had accumulated over the past few weeks. The case had been a labyrinth of lies, half-truths, and deceit, and she knew she was on the verge of unraveling the final pieces. She could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on her, but she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Lisa Matthews's death had initially seemed like an accident, a tragic and unfortunate event. But as Claire dug deeper, it became clear that the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Betrayal, rage, and jealousy had all played a role in the chain of events that led to that fateful night. Now, it was time to bring everything to light. The investigation had started with a simple question: who killed Lisa Matthews? But as Claire had delved into the lives of those closest to her, David Matthews, Pastor Harris, and even Lisa herself, she realized that the answers were much more complicated. It was clear now that Pastor Harris had been the one to set the wheels of tragedy in motion. His affair with Lisa had been the catalyst for the events that followed. Desperate to maintain his reputation and keep his sins hidden, Pastor Harris had tried to control the situation, manipulating those around him to cover his tracks. But it was his involvement in the days leading up to Lisa's death that would ultimately expose him. Claire had uncovered the phone records, the text messages, and the hotel receipts. All of it pointed to Pastor Harris's involvement in an attempt to silence Lisa. He had made arrangements for her to meet him the night she died, and it was clear from the evidence that their final conversation had not been a peaceful one. When Lisa threatened to expose the affair, Pastor Harris had panicked. He had tried to convince her to keep quiet, to forget everything that had happened, but Lisa had refused. In that moment, something inside Pastor Harris snapped. Claire could hear the phone call in her mind now. Pastor Harris had begged her to keep the secret, but Lisa had refused. The confrontation had escalated quickly, and Pastor Harris had lost control. He hadn't meant to kill her, but in his desperation to protect himself, he had pushed her too far. He had shoved her, causing her to fall and hit her head on the corner of the coffee table. It was a blow that would prove fatal. But Pastor Harris hadn't acted alone. The true tragedy was that David Matthews had unknowingly played a part in the death of his wife. His jealousy, his heartbreak, and his rage had fueled his actions in the days leading up to the confrontation. David had been spiraling, unable to deal with the betrayal. When he found out about the affair, his pain and anger had clouded his judgment. He had confronted Lisa, had yelled at her, and had even threatened to expose her. He had become convinced that Lisa was the one who had betrayed him, without realizing that the one truly responsible was the man he had considered a friend, a man who had been hiding in plain sight. David's emotional breakdown had pushed Lisa into a corner. She had become fearful for her life, desperate to escape the situation. But when she had gone to confront Pastor Harris, she had walked into a trap. The very man she had loved, the man who had promised her salvation, was the one who had betrayed her. Claire shook her head as she reviewed the final pieces of evidence. The case had become a twisted tangle of lies and emotions, with each person involved unknowingly playing a role in Lisa's death. It wasn't just one person's fault. It was the result of a series of choices, driven by betrayal, jealousy, and heartbreak. Claire knew it was time to make the arrests. The next morning, Detective Armstrong gathered her team. She had spent hours reviewing every detail of the case, and she was confident that they had enough evidence to make their move. She had the arrest warrants ready, and as the team assembled outside Pastor Harris's church, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The church, once a place of peace and sanctuary, now felt like a house of lies. Pastor Harris stood at the pulpit, his back straight, his voice strong as he spoke to his congregation. He had no idea that his world was about to come crashing down. As Claire and her team entered the church, Pastor Harris froze, his eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment she saw a flicker of fear. It was the same look he had given her during the earlier interviews, but now it was tinged with the realization that his lies had caught up with him. "Pastor Harris," Claire said, her voice calm but firm, "you're under arrest for the murder of Lisa Matthews." The room went silent. The congregation watched in shock as Claire and her team moved to arrest the pastor. Pastor Harris didn't resist, but there was no mistaking the fear in his eyes. The man who had once been a pillar of the community was now nothing more than a criminal, caught in the web of his own deceit. Meanwhile, David Matthews was at home, unaware of the impending arrest. He had spent the night drinking, trying to numb the pain of losing his wife, but he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. As the police arrived at his doorstep, his heart sank. "David Matthews, you're under arrest for the murder of your wife, Lisa Matthews," Detective Armstrong said as she stepped forward. David's face turned pale, his hands trembling as the reality of the situation set in. He had no idea what to say, no way to explain the confusion and pain that had led to this moment. But Claire knew that the arrest was the final piece in the puzzle. The trial was long and painful, with both Pastor Harris and David Matthews facing charges for their roles in Lisa's death. Pastor Harris's defense tried to argue that it was an accident, that he hadn't meant to hurt Lisa. But the evidence was clear. His affair with Lisa, his desperate attempt to cover it up, and his violent outburst had led to her tragic death. The jury convicted him of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to prison. David Matthews, too, was found guilty. His actions had been driven by rage and jealousy, but he had contributed to the chain of events that led to Lisa's death. He was sentenced to several years in prison for his role in the tragedy. As Claire walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Lisa Matthews' death had been a tragedy, but the truth had finally come to light. The web of lies that had entangled everyone involved had been unraveled, and justice had been served. In the end, it wasn't just about the murder of one woman. It was about the consequences of betrayal, jealousy, and rage, the destructive power of lies, and the price that everyone would pay for them.